Hello, and thanks for visiting my channel. At this point in our studies of the major scale, we've learned how to form the major scale, how to play it across the fretboard in all keys with a variety of patterns, and then also some exercises to help us practice it. And now we turn our attention to some tips and techniques that will help us to add musicality to our playing. There's a lot to learn here, so grab your guitar, let's go. Before we begin our study of these tips and techniques, let's add a few more terms and definitions that will help us in our study. The first is scale degree. Scale degree refers to the position of a note in a scale relative to the root note or tonic note. It's useful to know where a note falls in the scale. Now, as you see in the chart, and we're using the C major scale here, as you can see in the chart, each note of the scale degree has a name which helps to describe its position in the scale. But especially for our purposes, we're going to concentrate on the numbers. So, for example, in our example of the C major scale, the G is the fifth scale degree, or just the fifth. So when you hear me refer to play the fifth in the key of C, that would be playing a G. The next term is interval. An interval is the distance between two notes. Now, when we learned the major scale, we learned how to form it because we had a specific formula. Well, that formula was made up of intervals, distances between two notes. To understand the name of an interval, you take your first note and you count to the note of the interval that you're trying to understand the name of. Take, for example, on the chart, if we start on the first note, C, which is the tonic or the root note, and we count up 4, C, D, E, F. And F is an interval of a fourth away from the C, or a perfect fourth. You can just remember it as a fourth. The next term is a term we've used before, and that's the term diatonic. And diatonic simply refers to of the scale. That's what it means. Or any note or chord that is of the particular scale we're using or within the scale that we're using. So when I speak of playing diatonically, when I refer to notes, that means all the notes in a particular scale that we're playing. If I refer to chords, it also refers to any chords in the scale that are only made up of notes in the scale. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on figuring out what chords are in the major scale in the next video. I hope you'll join me then. But for our purposes, diatonic simply means the notes or chords that are in a particular scale. Okay, let's get to the tips and techniques. And the first one is called playing sequences. A sequence is simply a pattern of notes that is repeated at different points within the scale. You can also think of it almost as numbers, if you will. So we're going to learn a few sequences for the sake of learning what a sequence is, but you're going to see you can make up nearly any sequence you can think of, hundreds of sequences, and practice those and all the positions that you have learned for playing the major scale in any key across the fretboard. So let's take a look at the guitar. All right, to keep things consistent, let's go ahead and work from our G major scale with the root on the 6th string that we've done in the past. The first sequence we're going to learn is the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, come back to the second note, 2, 3, 4, come back to the third note, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6, keep going. That would be an example of playing the sequence in an ascending way. We can also play that sequence in a descending form or backwards. The next sequence is simply to add a note to that sequence. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So let's go ahead and look at the guitar. That would be something like this. And so on. We can also play that backwards and sound something like this. And so on. Now you can mix up the sequences. They don't have to be in order. Here's a third example. What if we were to play 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, and so on. Let's take a look at the guitar. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, and on and on. Etc. So you can see we can really come up with a lot of different patterns and actually begin to change up these patterns, and that will help us create lines of interest for the listener when soloing in any particular key. The next technique is to use intervals. Intervallic playing is so very important to creating interest for the listener when you solo, because your lines sound more melodic, and it helps to improve your technique as well whenever you use large intervals, for example. Now we're just going to learn a few intervals in this study, but hopefully you'll expand that and add all the intervals in all the different positions, and that will help you to increase your ability to play with musicality. So let's take a look at the guitar. Remember, to form an interval, we simply use the first note and we count to the note that we want to have the interval with. So if I want to play a third, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. That's my third. So here's my third, the interval of a third. Now if I take the second note, count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So here's the interval of a third with the second note. And I can do that throughout the whole pattern. So to play in thirds, for example, would be to play the following. Now we can also play that backwards. Let's go ahead and do that. That's an example of playing intervals, in this case the interval of a third. Now you should be able to play that in all different patterns that we've learned. So let's go ahead and, for example, take it to the third position and show an example of playing in thirds there. And on and on. Another interval that's really cool on the guitar when you're soloing is the interval of a sixth. And it is especially neat whenever you're playing on the upper strings. So let me give you an example of playing in the key of G, some sixths. There's a sixth. Let's try that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So a sixth would sound like this. You might have heard lines like this. And that would be playing in sixth. We'll work on all your intervals and all the patterns, and that will really help you with playing musically. The third tip or technique is to play arpeggios. Now that's a new word for us. An arpeggio is a broken chord, if you will. It's to play a chord one note at a time, and generally in succession. So for example, I'm going to let's look at the guitar. Here is a C chord, an open C chord that many people know. If I was to play it as an arpeggio, I could just play those notes, open G, and that would be playing the C chord as an arpeggio. Now, we're not going to spend too much time on arpeggios in this particular study, but I wanted to introduce them because when you play over chords, there are certain tones, the chord tones themselves, that when you play them will really emphasize the chords, and they really add a lot of interest to the listener. So if we could learn how to play a chord in a broken way, in a single note way, and emphasize the notes in the chord, when we're playing over that chord, that's really going to make that chord pop out and really sound good. And so, just to give you an example, if I was to take the thirds in the key of G and just stack thirds, then I'll take a G to a B, remember that interval, that's 1/3, and then from this B, stack the next one to a D, that's another third. And in fact, if I take a look at, say, for example, a G chord, G, B, D, G, B, G, all the notes are either G's, B's, or D's. So if I can find those 3 notes in the G major scale and play them, then I'm really playing the G chord, but in a broken way, in our arpeggio. So let's do that. Look at the guitar. And that would be playing an arpeggio. We'll spend more time on arpeggios in our last video of this series. Okay, the next tip or technique is to play using slides. And a slide is created whenever you play a note, and then to hit the next note, you slide up to it, or you slide down to it. Now you can do that with the notes in any particular scale. Let's stay with our G scale and start here, for example, on the F sharp, and let's just go up. So that would be playing with slides. Here's an example of how you might incorporate a slide in a solo, and I'll just make something up. Something like that. The next technique or tip that we're going to learn is to play with hammer-ons or pull-offs. And they're really cool, especially with rock and roll guitar and blues guitar. But basically how you do that is you have a fretted note. I guess it doesn't have to be a fretted note, but anyway, a fretted note in this case. And to play the next note, instead of picking it, I hammer it on. Or, in the case of pull-offs, I fret both notes, I pluck the first, and I pull it off. In fact, when I pull, I'm sort of pulling the string as well. So hammer on, pull off. You can do that anywhere on the scale. Or descending. Now I can combine those. And if I do it quick enough, you have something called a trill. That type of thing. So that's the hammer-on and the pull-off, and it's very, very helpful to creating interest for the listener. So instead of just going, I might go. And that would be maybe a way to use hammer-ons or pull-offs. Okay, the next tip or technique to incorporate into your playing so that you can add musicality is to use bends or bending. The idea here is to take a note and to form, or when you pluck it, to make it sound like the next successive note, but not because you play or move up to that note, but because you bend that string to form that note. Now on an acoustic guitar, this is an especially difficult thing to do, especially on the lower strings, because they have such a thick diameter. It's much easier on the electric guitar, you'll find. But you can still do it on the acoustic guitar, especially on the top 2 strings, even maybe the top 3 strings. And I'm going to show you that when you bend, take a look at the guitar, instead of using just one finger, and you might be able to do that if your fingers are strong, I would recommend bending with your 3rd finger, your ring finger. And when you bend, take the first 2 fingers and put them right behind your ring finger and let all 3 fingers move the string. So if I wanted to play from here to here, I could go, that's a little sharp, but anyway, you get the idea. Or if I want to bend it higher to go from here to here, and that would be an example of using bends. So let me play just a little line and I'll incorporate a bend in there somewhere. Here we go. You notice that I can bend going up, but I can also start the bend and then hit the note and let it come down. That's another technique. So use bends whenever you're playing your solos. Now the last technique is to use what's called vibrato, and you've probably seen me do that before. And that's just to take a note when you play it and to move it back and forth real quickly. I usually do it in a vertical way. So let's look at the guitar. Taking, for example, this note, instead of just plucking it and let it ring, I'll move it up or down. And that adds a little character to it. So once again, let's just play a line and add vibrato. Okay, so that might be an example of that. Let me add one final word with regard to practicing these tips and techniques. I would recommend, whenever you actually do the practicing, we learned them in this video, but when you practice them on your own, to have some type of musical context, a musical background playing so that you can hear how these techniques, especially the intervals, the arpeggios, the sequences, how they sound over some musical context. And that might be as simple as this. You simply go and you play a G. If you're playing the G major scale. And that's it. And you record that or have a friend play that while you're playing your little lines. Or, as we did in the last video, maybe have some little song in the key of G if you're practicing G, or the key of C if you're practicing in the key of C, or whatever, B flat, doesn't matter. Play some song using diatonic chords, chords that simply belong to that particular key. That will help you to hear how your lines sound over it, and that's really going to improve your playing. Well, as we alluded to earlier, we have one more video left in this major scale series. The 5th and final video is going to be discussing chords. You see, the major scale doesn't just give us single note lines to play, but it also gives us chords to play. And so we're going to learn the chords in the major scale, 3-note chords, triads, and then 4-note chords, 7th chords. And we're going to learn an easy way to remember how to play all of them across the fretboard in all keys, essentially adding about 140 chords to your chord vocabulary. And then we're going to spend a little time on arpeggios again, maybe expanding our study of arpeggios just a bit. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. To learn more, subscribe to my channel, click on the like button. In fact, click on the bell when you subscribe, and that will alert you to when a new video comes up. In the meantime, go grab a guitar and go have some fun playing it using these tips and these techniques. Bye-bye.